Welcome back to Master Wire Jewelry. Today we are going to finish the chain that we made in the last video. Before we can actually do the finishing on this though, we need to make a couple of pieces. One of the pieces we have to make are these end caps. We also need to make a hook so that we can close our bracelet. And I really like to make a little chain of jump rings here. So we'll show you how to make all of these pieces next, okay? Get these out of the way. Let's start with our end cap. One thing that's really important about your end cap is that it needs to fit snugly around your weave, okay? Here I've got an example where I've got a slightly thinner weave than that one, and I've got an end cap that would fit on that thicker one, but watch what happens when I put it on this thin one. It kind of moves around. It doesn't look very nice because it's actually too big. So you really want to make sure that you're making this the right diameter for the weave that you've already pulled through your draw plate. So that's why you have to do the draw plate before you make your end caps. So to make my end caps, my favorite tool are my bail making pliers here. I have a couple sets of them. This one is 8 and 6 millimeter, and this one is 3 and 5 millimeter. So I most commonly use the 6 and 5 millimeter. So this slightly thicker one is a 6 millimeter. You can see it's just exactly the same width as my jaw is the same width as my weave, but it's going to be too big for this one. You see how it like sticks out? So that's going to be too big of a mandrel to use for this chain. But let's check out my 5 millimeter ones. That's pretty darn close. That's pretty much exactly the right diameter that matches my chain. So this is going to be the mandrel that I use. I actually don't start with this set of pliers though. The very first thing we need to make on this end cap is this spiral on the end. Okay, so let's start with that. I'm going to use an 18 gauge copper wire here. And I have to make sure I'm starting with a super square end cut. That's not bad, but I just want to make sure that it's a square end cut, so I just cut a little tail off. Now I need to start making that spiral on the end. So it starts with a P-loop. Hopefully we're all super familiar with a P-loop. Make sure you're not sticking that end too far out. I do make this fairly close to the tips of my pliers because otherwise you're going to get a really big hole in the middle there. So I've made my P-loop. I'm going to stick my jaw back in, and I'm kind of grabbing the back of the P-loop, the back spine of the P-loop. And now my finger's really close because I want to make a really tight spiral. And I can bring the wire about halfway around my P-loop. I can't really go much farther than this because in order to grab on, this plier jaw is in the way. I can't really go past there without going around this plier jaw, and that's not what I want to do. So I'm going to put my round nose pliers down, turn to my grabbers. This shouldn't be wholly unfamiliar to you if you remember from module 1 where we do spirals. All right. Through experience, I know that that's about as much as I need on the end. If you were going to make a bigger one, you might have to go maybe halfway around or another full spiral. You actually want to make this spiral 1 wire thickness larger than the mandrel you're going to make. So I'm actually going to make that just a little bit bigger, but don't go too nuts here. Once it's as big as you need it to be, so that's about good there. I can see my wire poking out on either side of the mandrel that I'm going to use. Once you're happy that that's as big as you need it to be, I'm actually going to continue to coil this wire around, but now I've actually brought it underneath of this spiral. Can you see that? How it's not getting any bigger around, but I've actually brought it underneath, okay? And that's it. I've just brought it underneath, and that's as much as I can do with my grabbers. Now come these wonderful bail making pliers. I am going to grab onto this wire, just this little piece that's right underneath. And that's all I've got, but it's just enough for me to grab onto. And I'm going to continue wrapping this wire around this mandrel. My top, it's not perfect. I'm okay with that. I'm going to come back and fix that when I'm done. Right now, I just want to make this long enough that it's going to hide everything that I need it to hide. Because when we go to attach the end of our bracelet, the end of our Viking knit weave, whether it's a bracelet or a necklace or whatever you're making, you need to make a loop that's hidden inside of this end cap. So, and that's kind of how everything's attached. So you can always cut some of these off later if it's too long, but you do need it to be long enough. So, you know, an inch is lots. I usually do somewhere around 3/4 of an inch. I'm going to call that good. So now when I cut this off, I don't want to cut it off here. I want to cut it off back here. And I'm careful to only cut my end wire. And when I say back here, I mean, I want to cut it off on part of this curve. If I cut it off like even here, I'm going to have just a little bit more wire that I have to curve around, but I'm not going to have any tail to help me do that. Okay, so in order to prevent you having to do that step, I'm actually just going to cut it here, and then my tail is already in the right place, and I don't have to do any finishing or trying to push that down and have it bounce back up. So make sure I'm only cutting through one wire. There we go. And now you see the end is already in a perfect coil around, and I don't have any tail to like press down onto my mandrel. All right, so let's go back to the top. This is almost always a little bit funny and cockeyed when I do this. So you kind of have to go in. Sometimes it's not even perfectly centered, although this one isn't too bad. The first thing I'm going to do is kind of press it down to get rid of this. You usually do get a tiny little bit of spring, but it's not usually too bad. It goes down enough. And now you got to be super gentle during this step, but I'm going to kind of just squeeze this whole thing until it's all lined up. And that looks pretty good to me. There's a tiny little bit. This does spring up. You're never going to get it to lie down just absolutely flawlessly perfectly, but you can usually get it close enough that it's fine. So ta-da, there's my one end cap. I will need to make another one of these for the other end. I need 2 for each piece of Viking knit weave. I need 1 for each end. So that's how to make our end caps. Next, I want to talk about making this hook. There are lots of different hooks on the internet. This is my favorite. I like it for a couple of reasons. One, it's got 2 wires, so that adds more strength than if there was only 1 wire. The biggest reason I like it is this end here has a little round bulbous, I don't know what to call that, wide bit, which makes it not sharp or scratchy at all. It makes it really soft, and you're not going to have to do any filing here or making this like less scratchy or itchy. You don't have a cut right here that you have to file down. So these are some of the reasons why I like this hook so much. It's a little bit complicated to make, but I'm going to go over all these steps with you so that we can do it together. I'm still going to use my 18 gauge wire. I got kind of a little nub here that I don't like. I'm just going to cut that off. Just a tiny little bit. Put it in my scrap bin. Now I want to cut off 4.5 inches of my 18 gauge wire. All right, get that out of the way, get that out of the way. 4.5 inches. If you want, you can straighten it. Doesn't really matter. We're going to put so many bends in this, it's not a big deal. Now I'm going to grab with my round nose pliers 1.5 inches from one end. I'm just going to grab my ruler so you can see that. I tend to estimate this. That's just a little under 1.5 inches. Let's just go about there. So 1.5 inches from one end of your 4.5 inch piece of wire. From here, I'm going to basically make a U around one of my jaws, around the end of one of my jaws. You don't want to make this too big of a bulbous end because that end of the hook I was talking about, that non-scratchy end of the hook, this little loop right here, this is actually what we're making right now. But you see how it's like an open loop, but then they come, I don't know, I'm sorry, that's a bad angle. They come together, these wires. This is kind of a tricky thing. If you're just watching me do it, you you probably wouldn't understand how I'm doing it, so I need to do some explaining here. I'm going to stick one of my jaws in this U that I've created, and now I am grabbing on my pliers hard enough that they're closing, but I'm not actually like gripping my wire. I'm closing them so that this upper jaw is sliding on my wire, but it's not actually grabbing it. Okay, and so now I'm going to slide this all the way around and make kind of an indent here. Okay, I make this look really easy. It's kind of weird movement because you're not actually gripping with your pliers very hard. I'm going to do the same on the other side, where I'm going to use this jaw here to kind of push in this little indent. And when you're done, this is what you want to have. Okay? It's just a little bulbous end. It's not scratchy at all. And I really like how that comes out in the end. Okay, so let's keep going. We've got a long tail and a short tail. We need to put a 90-degree bend into the long tail. I'm going to bend it away from the short tail, and I need that bend to be just a little bit before the end of the short tail. So that was a lot of description for that. That's the bend that we want to make. It's about 90 degrees or even a little bit less, okay? And I made it with the tips of my pliers, so it's a fairly short, sharp bend. From here, I need to put a loop on this side that's bigger than this one. So I'm going to grab up a little bit farther on my plier jaws, and I'm positioning it just on this other side of the bend that I just made. I'm going to take this long tail, bring it around this bottom jaw, all the way around. This is the confusing part. From here, I actually have to, let me just pull that tight, let go with my pliers and swing them around and grab on again. I am grabbing my loop this time. This is the same tail I was working with before, and I'm just going to continue to bring it around. And it's almost a 90-degree angle between that tail and this double post. So now, I have another funny movement that I do here. Because I'm so used to making loops at the end of one single wire, I almost always make this loop so it's centered at the end of this wire. However, we've got two wires here, and it's not centered at the end of both of those wires when they come together. So I actually need to do a funny little movement where I roll this loop back this way, so it's centered at the underneath of both of these wires. So I basically put my jaw back in and I fill up that loop. You don't want to do this like this. Okay, you want to shove your jaw all the way in so it's filling up that loop. I'm grabbing on, so I'm gripping that loop. My finger's right here in this corner, and I'm actually unbending that bend a little. Did you see that? I just rocked that back a little. It's not quite enough. I'm going to go a little farther. There. What I want is for this to be going across that loop so that when I squeeze this together, this tail is going to kind of dip down into that loop. Watch when I do this. I don't know if you saw that, but now this is kind of dipping down into that loop. When I squeeze it tight, it holds these together. Because of that adjustment I made on my loop, this isn't quite 90 degrees anymore, so let's just unbend that. So we've got our 90 degrees here again. I'm ready to wrap this tail around both of these wires. You've only got one directional option depending on whether it's above or below, so just go with the direction that it's in. Me and my 3 wraps, I like my 3 wraps, what can I say? I stop here, this is a very specific spot. I've got this tail on this side. Oops, sometimes I can get in there and lift that up. I need another set of pliers. I like to just lift that back out of that loop so I can get my cutters in there and cut it. And this is coming over the same side, so I'm actually going to have both my tails on this side, both my cut ends on this side. So let's show you what that looks like. Get the tips of my flush cutters in here to get rid of this tail. There it goes. And now I want to cut this tail off so it's flush with the edge of these 2 wires. So something like this. I do usually come in and squish this tight one last time. If things are a little twisted and wonky, you can squish everything so it's flat. If you want to, if you love hammering, you can stop at this point and hammer this, and that will add strength. I find I don't always bother. With the hammering, this is strong enough without the hammering because it's two 18 gauge wires, and it's going to be not a super huge hook. Okay, so I've got both my tails on this side. I can feel the one here, and there's one on the inside here. So they're both on the same side, which means that this outside, I can't see any tails, and this is going to be my outside finished side, okay? So I'm looking at my finished side. I need to bring my pliers back in. You can use your grabbers for this or your round nose pliers. And so I'm looking at my finished side. All my tails are back here, and I'm gonna bend this up at pretty much a 90 degree. So this is just this little bulbous round thing just bent up at 90 degrees. All right, so from here, because we've got two wires, we don't want to do this next bend with just our round nose pliers. We really do want to use our bail making pliers so that both of these wires sit next to each other. So the best way to do this is kind of grab in the middle. And now this is a little bit hard on your fingers, but I'm basically going to bring both sides of my hook down and around. And what I want is for this inside bend to meet up with these wraps. Okay, so sometimes that means bringing one side around more. Sometimes it means bringing the other side around more, but you can almost always control where these meet up by just bringing one side around or the other side around. So we're almost there. There's only one more kind of main bend we need to make in this, but it's a really important one. A couple more tweaks, actually. I'd really like for there to be a funnel leading into your hook so that when you go to actually put something in here, as long as it finds this spot, it funnels it in. But sometimes I will just bend this back a little, and I'll just make sure that this ended up at a decent angle to make that like funnel into the hook. The other thing I need to do, if you leave it like this and you've got a little bit of space here, you're going to find that this spring doesn't let it close all the way. And I've had customers, when I made hooks and I stopped here, complain that they would lose their necklace or their pendant because it just slipped out of here. So this last step is super, super, super important. And it's also a little bit dangerous, but I actually bring my pliers over my hook, over both wires of my hook. So I'm not just doing one side. And now if your pliers slip, don't have your fingers in here because you're going to get a blood blister. Keep your fingers well away. And I'm going to just very gently give this a squeeze. Did you see that? This whole thing changed shape a little bit. And now I've got tension. Tension holding this right to those wraps. It's going to be a little bit harder to put something in and out of here, but it's going to be much more secure and things are not going to fall out of this hook now. So that last like squeeze creates a tension in here that you want. So that's a really important step. Otherwise, you don't want somebody to lose this piece of jewelry you've spent so much time on. So that's our hook. We've got a hook. We've got an end cap. I'm not quite ready yet. Let's make some jump rings. If you don't already know how to do this, this is endlessly useful for making chain, for making anything. Got my 18 gauge wire again. I'm not going to worry about my cut on the end because I'm just going to cut it off. And I'm just going to start coiling down a mandrel. The size of your mandrel isn't super important. If it's bigger, you're going to get bigger chain lengths. If it's smaller, you're going to get smaller chain lengths. That's it. If you have an oddly shaped, like these don't have to be round lengths. They can be oval or rectangular, or if you have a different shaped mandrel you want to use for this, then that's fine. You can use whatever shape of links you like. But always make a little more than you think you need because sometimes these get lost. All right. So this is how jump rings are made. From here, you always make a coil the size you need of the jump rings with the right thickness that you want for your jump rings. There are several ways of dealing with this coil. The best, most professional way is to take a jeweler's saw and literally cut down one side of this. You often need to use some painter's tape and tape it up so that it stays together and it's contained to do the sawing. That's going to give you the nicest jump rings with the nicest ends. And if you do want to like solder them together or something, you almost do have to cut them, or you're going to end up having to file these in order to do a proper solder. But if you're not going to solder these, if we're just counting on the strength of the wire to hold these open loops closed, you can just use a pair of good flush cutters to cut these out. A couple things though, I've already cut a nice flush cut on this end. So I actually have to flip my cutters over and cut the next one here. Oops. All right, get rid of that. So now, because my flush cutters were like this, I've actually got a super pointy end on the end of the next jump ring that I have to get rid of. So I've flipped my cutters over and I'm just going to cut off a tiny little bit to get a nice flat surface there again. Oh, I'm throwing stuff on the ground. There we go. And then I flip my cutters over again and I cut my next jump ring. Then I flip my cutters over and I cut this pointy bit off. Then I flip my cutters over and I cut the next jump ring. And then I flip my cutters over and cut this pointy tail off. And I flip my cutters over. Do you see the pattern here? It gets a little repetitive, I have to say. And that's how you get your jump rings, okay? Now, like any of those open or closed loops, the best way to open and close a jump ring is with a couple sets of pliers, and you just want to, oops, if there's a little bit of gap there, just close that gap by going back and forth. When you're done, hopefully this isn't too itchy and these fit together pretty darn nice. That looks better. So that's my closed jump ring. I'm going to do another one. When you cut these, cut a whole bunch, cut at least 7 or 8 for each bracelet, and close half of them, okay? After you've got half of them already closed, then you start taking the other half of them, you open them up, and you put 2 closed jump rings on it, and then you close this one up. Right like that. You want it to feel fairly nice. Now I've got 3 jump rings, and I would continue to do that. I would take the next open jump ring, I would add this ring onto it and 1 more closed jump ring, and then I would close that one up, and then you'd have 5 jump rings. These grow very quickly, and again, they don't have to just be round, they can be any shapes, but this is basically how you make your extender chain that your hook hooks into. I really like, just for the sake of the piece of finished jewelry, I really like having this extender chain because it allows a person to hold on to the end of it, wrap the bracelet around the wrist, and then you can actually put the bracelet on, usually without too much trouble, all by yourself. So that's why I really like the extender chain on this, because it allows you to put that piece of jewelry on and off without assistance. So it is worth it to make like a couple inches of chain. Depending on how big your links are, is going to dictate how many links you need. All right, we've gone over our end caps and our hook and our extender chain, which is also how you make jump rings, which is also extremely useful if you do want to make your own jump rings. It's hard to find coppery jump rings out there. I think we're ready to start attaching everything together. All right, so this is the side that I started with. It's got my busted flower starter piece here that I busted when I pulled it through the last hole in my draw plate. And now if you look carefully, you can actually see like the levels of the stitches here and here and here. Okay, the first one, remember, was a single stitch, so it's kind of funny. And then here we started doing our first double stitch, and I am going to bring my flush cutters in and I am going to put them halfway down my first double stitch. I'm being careful not to be right on this joint, but kind of halfway in between, and I'm just going to cut it off. Dun dun dun, that's a little bit scary, I know. It's gonna be okay though. So now we've got a whole bunch of loose bits from that cut. This is completely normal. we are just going to spend a minute and pick all these tails out of here. Sometimes they come out easier than others, but with a little bit of persistence, they will come. All right, there's that. Once you've got all of these tails out of here, you'll know that you do because you only have one tail left. There, this one's still in there, and I think that's my last tail that's left. You will always have one wire end because it's just the nature of the weave. But that's it. I've gotten all these other little like U pieces out of there, okay? From here, this one tail end, I want to just grab with my pliers and fold over inside of my weave. Now, because we did 5 stitches, there's 1, there's 2, there's 3, there's 4, and there's 5. This other one is my tail. And because they're double stitches, there's 6, there's 7, there's 8, there's 9, and there's 10. That's a lot of loops to keep track of. Okay, each one is a double loop. The one is going to be taller than the other. What we need to do is we need to put one piece of our 18 gauge wire through all of those loops. Some people think you only need to get the end 5. That's probably going to be okay. If you're not sure about that, then you can go through all 10. But I think I'm just going to use the end 5 in this case. So there's 1, there's 2. That one's got an extra one. I'm okay with that. This one's got an extra one. And now this one. And I've kind of just shoved them all so they're in line. They're still a little bit messy, but they're all kind of in line. And they're all oriented the same way so that it can come in here. I'm actually just going to cut off a piece of this about 4 or 5 inches. I'm not even going to measure it. And let's see what I got here. I'm going to go through here and here. Get it. You need to get at least all of the top 5 loops. If you can get all 10 of those loops, you're going to be even better off. All right. There. I'm happy with that. I've gotten through probably about 7 of those loops. Okay. From here, I need to squish this all together again after pulling it all apart. And then I just make a sharp bend in my 18 gauge wire to the point where I'm actually going to make it super sharp and squish this together. The reason that I'm being so careful to get all of this super tightly together is because it has to fit inside of this end cap that I made. All right, so I've got a long tail and a short tail. I'm going to use my short tail to cross my long tail. And now you probably have to brace this loop. And I just want to make one kind of full wrap around my long tail. And I'm going to cut this off. That one full wrap is going to be enough because it's such a heavy gauge wire that's going to be enough to make it secure. From here, oops, I need to get my end cap. And this is my spiral on this end. I'm going to thread it through so it comes out the end of my spiral. Push it down, push it over top of this kind of mess at the end. And if you've made it the right size, it should just fit really tightly and snugly over top of your weave. I actually had to grab the end of this to shove that on the rest of the way. And notice I'm not pulling it like this because this is a spring and it'll just come apart when it stops here. I'm pushing it from here, and that's going to help keep all of this together. Okay, so we are ready. Hopefully from here it's not going to be rocket science. We're ready. Let's add our hook to this side. I'm going to make a short bend, a sharp bend, a short distance from where it comes out. So I have grabbed this where it comes out of my end cap and made a bend on top of that. So I've got a short distance here where it comes out of my end cap straight. From here I need to make a loop. So bring in my round nose pliers. You never want to just make a loop. You always got to wrap it around something. Up and around towards you and down. Let go with my pliers, bring them up to the top of that loop, down and away. So this is basically or closed loop, but with a little bit thicker wire. I'm going to put my pliers right down. I'm going to stop here, and this bigger loop on my hook is what goes over here, and I have to kind of snap it in place so it goes right around that loop. Now I'm ready to wrap this tail, so I need to grab across the loop that I'm making. This tail ended up in between my hands. That's exactly what I want. And now I've got just this little bit of space that I like planned ahead for, and I have space to wrap my tail around and make a nice secure closed loop. Cut my tail off, making sure to not cut anything else. And now every time you cut a wire end off of a finished piece, you got to come back with your pliers and make sure you don't have any scratchy bits. So you got to tuck that back in. So that's basically it. This is how you attach any end to your Viking knit. Now it doesn't matter how long you make this. You can make this, you know, into a necklace. I've seen beautiful pieces where you have a pendant and then you have a piece of this kind of going up from one side of your pendant and up from the other side of your pendant just for a short ways, and then they do other links and go the rest of the way around the necklace. So I've seen this used in lots and lots of different ways. When you do get to the other end, I just want to do this. Let's say I've cut this off till, let's just pretend I've figured this out and that's exactly the length that I need. I haven't, and it's not. I'm gonna have to do this again to make a bracelet, and it's too short for a necklace. But anyway, let's pretend I have. And how you would determine that is you would measure your wrist, if it's for you, or if it's for somebody else, measure their wrist tightly, not like cut off the circulation, but you want to know their wrist size. Now, if they like a tight fitting bracelet, you want to add 1/2 inch. If they like it a little more loose fitting, you want to add 3/4 inch to their wrist size. Once you know the size of bracelet that you want, well, you would bring your ruler in, especially once you have one side already done. Measure from the end of your hook, and now you would imagine your other end cap on the other end, and then your chain on the other end of that, and you kind of want the finished length to be the short end of your chain. So you kind of have to work backwards and be like, okay, here's my end cap, that's where that's going to go, so I want this to sit on the, you know, about halfway up my end cap. So that's about where I would do it for about an 8-inch bracelet is about here. I would cut it for an 8-inch bracelet. So I don't know, sometimes you just have to play with that a little. Let's just pretend this is the right length. I just want to show you this again on the other end. I haven't actually made my other end cap, but it'll be the same as my first one. But first you got to spend a minute and get rid of all of these wire ends. Here's the last one. Nope, not the last one. Here's another one. There's a lot of these. That's pretty normal at this point. See one more. There we go. Straighten it out. There. Okay, and my wire end. There's always going to be one wire end. If you've got more than one wire end, you've got more cut off tails that haven't come out. So I always take my wire end and I bend it in to the middle of my weave. From here I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, those are my top 5 links. I'm gonna just kind of twist them and get them in line with each other again so I can get my 18 gauge wire through all of them. Let me cut off a piece of this wire and see if I can't get it through here. 1, 2, 3, 4. I think that's it right there. Make sure you get at least the end 5 loops, okay? If you've done 5 stitches around your dowel. If you've done 6 stitches, make sure you get the end 6 loops. So again, a sharp U. I like to squeeze everything super tight so it'll fit inside of my end cap. I'm going to just make one wrap around here to make sure everything's secure and it's not going anywhere. All right, there we go. From here I would add my end cap. This is not the right size end cap. This is that other one that's too loose. I'll show you again what it looks like when it's too loose. No good. I'm not actually going to use this end cap, but from here I would grab on so I have just a little bit coming straight out. I'm going to do a bend away from me. I'm going to make my closed loop, and then I'm going to add my little jump ring chain to that. I hope that's clear. If it's not, send me some questions in the email, and I will do my best to answer them. Thank you so much for watching. That was a lot of fun. Have a great day.